Hello, good afternoon to everybody, at least in this part of the world, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us in different time periods. Some of us I know are very early in the morning, and some of us are very late in the evening. Although we are sorry not to be able to manage a face-to-face event, this online meeting actually is a really fantastic chance for so many more people to get together and join us today in this webinar organized as Helen has already said by the Royal Anthropological Institute. And I would like to thank the organizer and also Helen and Amanda in the background for the support. My name is Elisabetta Colla. I'm an Italian sinologist settled in Portugal for over 20 years now. I'm teaching East Asian art at the School of Arts and Humanities of Lisbon University. And we have, as you saw, a very wonderful lineup of panelists today from all different parts of the world and from many different backgrounds in celebration of the special issue Asian collection outside Asia, questioning artifacts, cultures, and identities in the museum, edited by Iside Carbone and Helen Wang. It is then my really pleasure to chair this launch event for this collection of thought-provoking articles to which I had the opportunity to contribute with a very small afterwards. Considering the reception of Asian materials across culture, especially in the light of growing interaction between different cultures as consequences of an increasingly interconnected world, enables the reader to reflect on cultural tropes related to art, materiality, and Asia, but also leaves some questions open, such as, for instance, is art what we really think is? Why certain kinds of objects are chosen to represent specific cultural identities within museums? And is Asia outside Asia only represented within museums? So these are just a few open questions that one can address eventually to the editors of this beautiful publication, who I'm really glad to introduce to you right now. Iside Carbone, anthropologist and specialist in Chinese art and culture with a particular interest in museum ethnography, and Helen Wang, curator of the Asian numismatic collection of the British Museum. So please, Iside and Helen, the floor is now. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Elisabetta, for this introduction. We are here today because the purpose of this event is, of course, to introduce our publication. But this is also an occasion to acknowledge all those whose help has been essential all the way through. Helen and I would like to acknowledge, first of all, and say a big thank you, historian Amy Mathewson. Her research interest is especially on China's relations with the global community through visual and material culture. And she meticulously reviewed all the articles for us. Another big thank you goes to Regina Höfer, a specialist in Indian and Tibetan art. And she invited us to publish Asia collections outside Asia as a special issue of the section Transcultural Perspectives, of which she is the editor, in the open access e-journal Kunsttexte. We are also very grateful for the dedication and support of all the authors to this project and for their enthusiastic participation to this launch today. A big thank you goes to Elisabetta for accepting our invitation to write the afterword and indeed to chair this webinar. And finally, we thank the Royal Anthropological Institute again for hosting the publication launch, and especially my RAI colleagues Hanin and Amanda for their technical assistance. And personally, I would like to thank Helen, as it has been a great pleasure and privilege to work with her on this project. And besides her always competent input, her encouragement and trust from the beginning have helped me enormously. I will now move on to outline the background and general framework of Asia collections outside Asia. But I will be brief, as it is most important to hear what the authors have to tell us about their case studies and about some of the features and issues related to this particular type of collections. So the main purpose of the panel at the RAI conference, Art, Materiality and Representation in 2018, and of the publication that ensued from that, was to bring to the fore collections of Asian materials that, when removed from the place where they were originally produced and used, become a niche category at the periphery of a universe of many other types of collections. The challenges that these collections face in the space of museums outside Asia are multiple and complex. Many factors can account for these challenges. For instance, the diversity of the objects in the collections, the presence of these collections in different types of museums, the inclusion or absorption of these collections into big, all-embracing institutions, the limitations and struggles of smaller specialist museums that remain in the shadow because of lack of recognition, lack of funding, lack of staff. It is therefore not uncommon for Asia collections in this context to end up invisible, unstudied, and ultimately risking to be forgotten. When we try to address these problems and elaborate possible solutions, we stumble over a variety of identity issues. First of all, the identity of the objects themselves. The winding and tangled paths they have been treading during their histories of production, use, appreciation, circulation, acquisition, recontextualization, and display lead to different levels of hybridity in terms of function and cultural belonging. Secondly, the identity of a collection. It is often the case, especially for logistic and epistemological reasons, that an attempt is made to classify a collection according to typological boundaries and stiff aesthetic distinctions. The collections then fall into separate compartments that define them as fine art, folk art, export art, tourist art, ethnographic artifacts, and so on and so forth. What we would propose instead is to break free from these categorizations that prevent exchange and cooperation between experts with different specialists and different theoretical and professional backgrounds. As we consider this group of papers as a whole, we aim at encouraging an overarching reflection on Asia collections in museums outside Asia that can be seen as an extensive range of material manifestations of cultural heritage. Next, we come to the debate around cultural identity, which attracts great attention and animated discussions as a sensitive and thorny topic. The open questions related to this debate intersect and intermingle, and we find them treated from different angles in all the papers in our publication. How is identity of the self constructed and proposed? What affects the perception and representation of identity of the other? When referring to a collection as a whole or even to a specific single object, is it possible to determine an unequivocal and absolute cultural identity? Should we instead prioritize an analysis of cultural interactions? If so, would it be appropriate to talk in terms of cultural hierarchies, layers of identity, or hybridity? Consequently, we are led to reflect on what constitutes Asia in these collections. Far from being an objective conceptualization, the acceptance of physical, geopolitical, and cultural boundaries often collides with a transnational and cross-cultural approach. At the same time, practical concerns and elements of contingency in the formation of a collection cannot be deemed irrelevant. While I have here only quickly touched upon all these ideas, I ought to frame them in the light of the current emphasis on decolonization seen as an epistemic shift that aims at questioning and challenging the controversial origins of certain collections and the lingering repercussions on the use and presentation of such collections. For a reasonable rebalancing of the engagement with the collections, we call for a mature and informed conversation intended to appraise without bias the nature, the purpose, and most importantly, the present relevance and the future of the collections. On this note, please let me conclude with a final reflection on the Asia collections at the heart of this publication. In order to make sure that besides and beyond the controversies, their potential is fulfilled in contemporary translocal, cosmopolitan, and multicultural settings, it may be most useful to consider them as shared heritage, namely complex cultural expressions of all those that contributed to develop into what they are today, and critical heritage, namely a material form of cultural memory that is unwrapped in the present, considering its wider social, political, ethical, and theoretical implications, and is projected into the future. And now, Helen, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iside. It's hard to believe that it's only about 3.5 years since we first met. Although we both work in the same building in the British Museum, I work on one side of the building in one department, in the Department of Coins and Medals, and Iside works on the other side of the building in the Library of the Royal Anthropological Institute. And for some reason, we had never met. And it is because of the event that Iside organized in June 2018 that we did meet, that when somebody, I don't know who it was, dropped out of the program, there happened to be a space, and Iside asked me if I would like to have that space. I came to the event. The event was wonderful. It was completely packed. I think there must have been something like 1 million papers in one day, or at least it felt like that. There was a real energy to that day. It was truly wonderful. And after that, because we were in the same building, we were able to have a cup of tea together and to have lunch together, maybe once or twice or 3 or 4 times. And Iside invited me to become a co-editor of this volume. And I'm very grateful to her for the wonderful work that she's done and for being such a fantastic colleague to work with. I'd also like to thank Amy Matthewson, who came in with fresh eyes and a fresh brain. If Amy's here, would you please? Oh, I don't know that we can see her, can we?
No.
No. That's a shame. But she came in at the end with fresh eyes and with a fresh brain, which was exactly what we needed. And we're very grateful to her. Also to the contributors, because it was a complete pleasure to reread the papers after 2 years. I've prepared a very small set of slides, which I will show you now, and then I will hand back to Elisabetta. So I will share my screen now. Sorry, my keypad is a bit sticky. So I'm going to ask, first of all, what is a museum? What's it all about? What's it for? These are 3 museums in Asia, and they're all very different. Maybe you'll recognize some of them, maybe you won't. What is a museum? Well, according to ICOM, the International Council of Museums in 2007, and remember that definitions change and people argue about definitions, a museum is a non-profit, permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. The word museum comes from the Greek museon, which meant the seat of the muses, and it designated a philosophical institution or a place of contemplation. The museum at Alexandria in Egypt was not a collection of works of art. It was the home of music and poetry, a philosophical school, a library, and a store of texts. And it was where some of the best scholars of the Greek world assembled and did their thinking together. This is the crucial thing, is that museums are not just storehouses, they're not just treasure houses, they're places where we can think and where we can think about the way we want to think now, the way we want to think in the future, the way we want to think with different people, And thinking changes over time. As museum curators, it is our job, curator means to look after, it is our job to look after the collections and to keep them in order. To keep something in order, there has to be a rationality behind the way we do things, behind the way we arrange things, the way we store things, the way we display things, record them, catalogue, publish them, and so on. And there are all kinds of factors that can inform the decision-making as to how we keep that order. It may be the physical size of the objects. It may be the status quo, this is how we've always done it, which is not always a good way to be. It may be that academic fields demand that we do things in certain ways. It may be funding. It may be the commercial value of the objects that we have. And all of these can contribute to the way that we, as in everybody, not just museum curators, think. Including in my own department, I work in the Department of Coins and Medals. I work on the collection of Chinese money at the British Museum, which was the subject of my presentation and which was the subject of the paper, my paper in the volume. Because if we only think about objects in museums as being art objects, we miss a huge number of objects. We miss a lot of material and a lot of content. As one of the two curators of the Asian coin collections at the British Museum, we look after tens of thousands of objects. If we dismiss them because they're not art, then we're losing a huge amount of information, a huge amount of knowledge, and we're losing different ways of thinking. I'm going to stop here and hand over to Elisabetta to enjoy the rest of the event today. Thank you very much, Iside and Hanin and Amanda, for arranging this. It's a complete pleasure, and it's lovely to see all of the participants of the event in 2018 again.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Iside. You have clearly pointed out the many aspects that make this publication so timely and relevant, especially in the context of the current debate on the practices of museums when dealing with objects produced by cultures different from their own. And as Helen has just pointed out, highlighting with her article the liminality of some objects that can be really difficult to categorize within Asian collections, but are nevertheless important to understand specific cultural traits. We now move on to explore with the authors of the other contributions some of the other key issues touched by their publication. And we then start with the representation of cultural identities related to specific collecting and curatorial choices as it emerges in the contribution by Donatella Failla, professor of East Asian art at the University of Genova, Maria Sobotka from the Freie Universität in Berlin, and with who is expert with expertise in Chinese and Korean art, and Robin Ruizendaal, director of the Taiyuan Asian Puppet Theater Museum in Taipei. So first, we invited Donatella to comment with reference to the Japanese and Chinese bronzes of the Chinese of the Kyosone Museum in Genova. So please, Donatella, the floor is yours now. You can start.
Thank you. Let me say just that it is a huge pleasure and a great honor to talk just after inspired persons like Iside and Helen. So thank you very much. So I am waiting for my presentation, I think, yes. And I will talk about Japan's archaistic style in bronze. So next slide, please. The Kyosone Museum of Genoa holds and exhibits the collections gathered by the artist Edoardo Kyosone over a 23-year stay in Meiji, Japan. Next. The Kyosone collection of Chinese and Japanese archaistic bronzes is numerous and remarkable. Its typological completeness and stylistic variety affording the research study of aspects of China-Japan art relations, as well as the transplant of Chinese art forms into the very body of Japan's artistic and aesthetic traditions. Imported into Japan from the 13th, 14th centuries up to the Meiji era, Chinese bronzes are part of the karamono, the things Chinese, a category of collectibles highly regarded by both the arbiters of taste and the political elite. Next. The ages-old permanence of Chinese bronzes in Japan was not without effects. According to historical records, Chinese bronze vases were copied by Japanese casters in the Muromachi period. Over the centuries, conservative Buddhist milieus favored ritual flower vases faithfully reproducing orthodox Chinese models whose style was Japanized and updated by adding Japan-conceived elements of symbolic and sculptural import, such as this three-clawed dragon coiling around the neck. Next, what I define as Japan archaistic style in bronze is a novel expression conceived in concomitance with the aesthetic innovations in Chanoyu, Tatehana, and Rika flower arrangements, which emerged in the mid-15th century, evolved through the late 16th century, and continued to develop until the final Edo period. By observing a few artifacts over time, we can recognize three main features in Japan's archaistic style in bronze. Next. The first feature is the transplant of ancient Chinese ceramic shapes into bronze and their Japanization through keen manipulation of line, profile, and volume. Here, an ancient Chinese jar with handles running from the mouth and pairs of spirals on the belly is set against the sketches of two metal mimikuchi hanaike in the Chinese collections of prominent Ikebanobo flower masters who used them for arranging tatehana in the 16th and early 17th century. Sorry, Hanin, I think that the slide is cut on the inferior side, but anyway. Next, please.
Sorry about that sound, sorry. I think everybody can see the full slide though.
Oh, good to hear. With the full development of the Rika arrangement style in the mid to late 17th century, though, the medium-sized Mimikuchi Hanaike was converted into a Rika-hei, a majestic bronze vase for stately flower arrangements to be offered both on temple altars and on special ceremonial occasions. Next. The second feature is the transposition of Japanese ceramic shapes into bronze. For example, the kiseto vase known as a shoulder drum was adopted and daringly altered by bronze casters, who further dignified it with Chinese archaistic motifs. Next, please. The third feature is the eclectic transplant of Chinese ornamental units into typical Japanese configurations of line, rhythm, and decorative space. This transformation resulting in unprecedented overall patterns. This freshwater container and implement historically associated with tea master Senno Rikyu is adorned with Chinese lappet motifs, unconventionally aligned in three superimposed rows circling the body, each row delimited by bowstring pairs and combined with three lines of ruisa, small bosses within double circles. This mizusashi is an outstanding example of Japan's archaistic style, showing a subtle beauty and featuring a solemn yet subdued and undefinable sense of antique classicism. Let me conclude by remarking that the delocalization of artworks out of their original civilization represents a most powerful vector for diffusing beauty, knowledge, and intellectual exchange throughout time and space. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Donatella, thank you so much to you. I really appreciated the cabin with the head, elephant head handle, very peculiar. So now we move toward Maria. Maria, could you tell us how objects and features of the Seuler Garten in Berlin are instrumental to the construction of the Korean identity. So please, Maria, the floor is yours now.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello from Germany, and thank you also to everyone for making possible this lovely event today. Yeah, it's just said. My topic today is the Korean garden in the Gardens of the World. And the Gardens of the World is a public park in Berlin that was created right after the German unification and showcases about 15 different gardens from all over the world, including also, by the way, an example of a British landscape garden. Sorry. The Korean garden, called Solar Garden, was a gift by the Seoul Metropolitan Government to the city of Berlin in 2006 in the context of their city partnership. As one of only 2 Korean gardens in Germany, it is one of the few places where South Korea officially presents its country and culture. Thanks to the Seoul Metropolitan Government that provided me with all documents and contracts that were created throughout the planning and building process, I could study this garden very thoroughly. And my analysis reveals the concept of the Solar Garden in Berlin as a meeting place for Germans and Koreans. The intention of the garden is to convey Korean culture and values to German visitors with the aim of deepening the 2 countries' relationship. It can be seen as a deliberate attempt of Korean authorities to construct a Korean cultural identity and present it to Germans using very hybrid features and a hybrid display. And I'm going to very quickly show you how they did this. So the Solar Garden has to a great extent been created based on the model of a 16th century Neo-Confucian literati garden in the southeast of Korea named Dongnakdang. And apart from similar approaches in construction and details, the garden features a lot of elements that are neither considered typical elements of a Joseon period garden, nor are part of the original garden, Dongnakdang. And the most striking amongst these are the many different stone and wooden figures that I'm going to show you today is one of actually many examples. And they mostly function to highlight the uniqueness of Korean culture and tradition, especially in comparison to the Chinese and the Japanese gardens, which is considered one of the most crucial points by the Korean side. As the following table shows, this is part of the planning documents by the Seoul Metropolitan Garden government, and they show the characteristics of Korean, Chinese, and Japanese gardens in comparison to each other. So the construction of the Solar Garden includes a cultural political function that should not be underestimated. It is not a compact version of a Joseon period literati garden, but primarily functions as a show garden to present a particular image of South Korea. The garden concept itself largely remains unexplained. Instead, because of the many statues and everyday objects of Joseon period, the garden can easily be perceived as overloaded. And I could further prove this as I did a survey covering about 300 visitors of the Korean garden that revealed the same. And the typical German visitor does not have a broader knowledge on Korean culture or the country, which actually did not change after visiting the Korean garden in Berlin. And neither could people distinguish between the Korean, the Chinese, and the Japanese garden. So the self-image which South Korea conveys with the Solar Garden can be seen as a reaction to the image it believes it has in the West. And likely the Korean government actively contributed to establish Korean gardens within Korean cultural diplomacy as a key component of a Western image of the country, because gardens have also shaped the image of Japan and China in the West for a long time now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I went to Berlin many times, but I didn't visit the garden. Next time, for sure, I'll do it, especially because it's a beautiful sample of Choson garden, so really a jewel within Berlin. The Taiyuan, now we move to another topic. The Taiyuan Asian Puppet Theater Museum has presented its collection and performances internationally, proposing elements of local Asian identities together with elements of, let's say, Pan-Asian identity. So, Robin, would you like to be so kind to illustrate to us this peculiar case of your museum, please?
I will.
And
pleasure.
thank you,
Good
Maria.
evening. Well, the Taiyuan Asian Puppet Theater Museum was a platform for the exchange of puppet theater artifacts, research, conservation, education, and performance. So we started collecting basically from Turkey to Japan puppet artifacts. And the collection started by Mr. Paul Lin, who started collecting in the 80s. And I continued this work over the past 20 years. So we have a collection of about over 10,000 puppets from all over Asia, as I said. So what are the common, because it's a very varied collection, but the common themes are that it's a theatrical, it's theater with a distinct musical element as well as a religious element. And moreover, it was the encyclopedia for Asian people at the grassroots level, where they could really learn everything about their own culture. Now, those are the common characteristics. Another common characteristic is the problem of conservation, what we're trying to do with preventive conservation and cooperation between different Asian museums, because there's no real puppet conservation work. So we work with many different museums as well as the artists themselves, how they handle embroidery, how they handle leather, and how they perceive the conservation of their tradition. Additionally, we do a lot of field work and research throughout Asia and work with the artists themselves. So basically from Cambodia to Japan to India and of course in China. And we try also to encourage people at the local level. Now, this is translated, of course, in publications that we do all around the world. Our famous Thames and Hudson book, who published a wonderful photo book about our collection, and recently in Portugal and Spain. So we translate it into exhibitions that we want to be really lively. So the modern museum, I think, is a 3D experience where you really enter into a different world. We have people carving puppets on site, making puppets, their performances. So I was very inspired by the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, which I visited many times. And so exhibitions really need to be alive and have a close interaction with the local community. Now, education for us is very important because young Asian children are as far from their own culture as Western children because of the modernization in Asia. So we have a very interactive approach to this. So this was a photograph of an exhibition about clowns, but also very interactive. So what we use is like Vietnamese water puppet theater. It's also very interactive. We do special classes for Aborigines in Taiwan for their local language education, and also a lot of hospital interaction performances as it empowers children to have a puppet and control it on their hands. At the same time, we have a theater company. So we work with different Asian companies and groups. This is a performance of shadow theater with Turkey and Beijing. and Taipei together. And we did a special performance about Asian monkeys with Thailand. So we had 5 different Asian monkeys on stage. So this was all part of creating this Pan-Asian feeling and bringing people together, performers and museum people. And we just continue to do that now in a new form as part of the Taiwan Museum to which we belong now. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Really, I found it fascinating this sample of puppets, and especially this idea of puppets being as an encyclopedia for modern children, modern people. So we now move to another topic. Actually, we are introducing another group of articles, and the topics that stands out particularly in the articles of Florencia Rodríguez Giavarini, art historian from the Universidad del Salvador in Buenos Aires, and Laura Vigo, curator of Asian arts at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, which these articles is the collecting display of Asian object in relation to a European cultural model as colonial legacy. So we now ask Florencia, we thank Robin again, and we ask Florencia to explain how the European influence in the formation of an Argentinian cultural identity can be seen in the display of Asian cultures in museums such as the National Museum of Oriental Art in Buenos Aires. Florencia, please.
Florencia, we can't hear you yet.
There, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Well, it's a pleasure to be and an honor to be a part of this panel today, and I thank everyone for their attention. And my presentation has to do with the Museo Nacional de Arte Oriental in Buenos Aires. And in this article, I was wondering whether how to distinguish true interest for the Eastern world from a deviation or a component of European taste. So I'm addressing that in Buenos Aires and in Argentina in general, but especially in Buenos Aires, different artifacts of Eastern origin have found their way as a result of either two kinds of initiatives, either scientific endeavors, which had a focus on ethnographical, anthropological perspectives, or as a result of collecting activities. And these Asian origins, or these Eastern origins, have found their way to different museums are of a great importance in Buenos Aires. But so we have been familiarized with this kind of objects through different perspectives. However, today I would like to focus on one object, which is part of the Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo, the National Museum of Decorative Arts, which used to be the residence of former ambassador of Argentina to France at the turn of the 20th century. So going back to this object, what I am addressed with this object, and what I think is very interesting is that this object has reflects different periods of appropriation of Eastern elements. And what we see here is a commode made by French cabinet maker Pierre Langlois, who used to work in England for English aristocrats in the French manner. This commode was first commissioned by Horace Walpole. Horace Walpole used to own a screen, a Chinese lacquered screen, and he gave this screen to this cabinet maker who was working in England in the French manner. So this first appropriation of the Asian element, this was the first process or the first step of obliteration of any relevant literary, religious, or any other meanings that this screen, which now makes the front doors of this commode, could have had in origin. To become something else, to become a different object, and to represent the taste of an English aristocrat in the 18th century in England, so that the Asian component became fused into this European taste. Further down the road, this object was acquired by Matías Errázuriz, the ambassador of Argentina to Paris at the turn of the 20th century, as I mentioned, who had commissioned this huge residence to be his home family residence, which later down the road in the late 30s became the Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo. In this Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo, this object once again, in my view, transformed into a representation of what the taste of these rich estancieros was like, and we were once more further removed from the Asian component of this Asian look but European taste object. In Argentina in the 60s, only in the 1960s, although since the viceregal period in the 16th century, Asian objects were coming in, it was only in the 1960s that the Museo Nacional de Arte Oriental was conceived. And it was an important foundation, because the Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo, as I explained before, displays many objects which come from the Eastern world. In this event, for example, we are seeing one of the rooms of the Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo, which displays Asian objects in the Art Deco room, because it provides to that European flavor. However, the Museo Nacional de Arte Oriental was intended to display objects in their Asian, trying to promote and to make it known and to preserve these Asian artifacts without any interventions, or with the least possible intervention of the Western world, so that they could be known, appreciated, and further understood. Unfortunately, now the two institutions have been fused again together, which endangers our possibility to appreciate the foreign or the Eastern character of these objects, which are more and more each time perceived as European as a result of the management of a museum which handles exhibitions, as you can see in this slide, Museo Nacional de Arte Decorativo, Aires de Kabuki on popular Japanese theater, but the Museo Nacional de Arte Oriental only appears as a minor or as a small mention, instead of appearing as the protagonist of this immense cultural patrimony that the museum owns and needs to make known to the public. So that's basically what my paper was dealing with.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florencia. It was very nice to see this Biobu stamped on a cabin. So now we move to Laura. Laura, could you please outline the parallel case in Canada through the example of the Asian collection of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts? Please.
Yeah, I was just looking at the architecture, in fact, of the museum, which actually is kind of parallel to our museum, as I will show now. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. So the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, with its now 5 pavilions and over 40,000 objects, stands at the core of the Golden Square Mile, which an area that was built in the late 19th century for and by the wealthy Anglophone families linked to the railway boom, and they were known as merchant princes. Their social homogeneity and great entitlement contributed to the creation of several architectural landmarks in the area. And like a temple, the museum, or a palace, the 1912 building that you see here illustrated provided a ritual site where religion and royalty got replaced with a cult of art, as the new Canadian citizens felt compelled to be seen as civilized and civilizing. The museum's Asian collections provided a fascinating time capsule for collecting practices and aesthetic preferences, as it was collected only in the first half of the 20th century. The core Chinese and Japanese objects came, and especially 3D objects, came from a small group of connoisseurs charmed by the surge of Japanese Chinese arts at the turn of the century on the North American market. Among them, William Van Orn, Love Strathcona, and of course, our dashing first director, Cleveland Morgan. So let's start and see William Van Orn, who was actually president of the Canadian Pacific Railway and one of the earliest collectors of Asian material in Canada. He had a very eclectic taste for exotica, as we would say, but his real obsession was Japanese domestic pottery, which he accumulated in thousands of pots and that he carefully drew and watercolored. His choices were informed by Bostonian friends like John Lafarge, the painter, and Edward Sylvester Morse of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts fame, and by dealers like Matsuki Bunkyo and Ninagawa Noritane. As his contemporaries, Van Orn perceived Asian art as pure and original when compared especially with Western academic paintings. So he fantasized Orient, specifically Japan, was redefined by taxonomically categorizing its material culture. Van Orn's friends on the left, Love Strathcona, who was Canada's High Commission to the United Kingdom, had comparable inklings. Both were New World capitalist industrialists involved in the railways, whose art collection positioned them as men of means and arbiters of taste, but were also tangible symbols of an all-encompassing British Empire to which they so proudly belonged. Morgan was initiated, our director, was initiated to Japanese art by William Van Orn, and we shall see how. But let's look at their obsession. By collecting hundreds of unassumingly similar tea caddies, taire, both men Japanese tea caddies, both men share an urge rooted in Victorian imperialism, associated with the spasmodic acquisition, organization of information, and exhibition of objects from countries in which the British Empire had colonial aspirations. Their predilection was shared by other Western collectors, for instance, Havenmeyers at the Met or Wollaston Frank at the BM. They're good examples. So without setting foot in Japan, they purchased locally and embarked on a taxonomic quest. Mentored by Van Orn, it is not surprising that among the first Japanese objects Morgan acquired for the museum, there were tea caddies. Morgan emulated his teacher, not only in collecting them, but also in illustrating them. As you can see, the photo on the right and the watercolor are actually of Morgan. These small containers were preferred perhaps because they could easily be carried and handled. Their cultural essence captured by studying their formal qualities and by verifying their authenticity. They provided a tangible idea of Japan, small, contained, and consumable. Tactile in spirit and quickly assembled, the collection of almost 3,000 kogo, incense boxes from Japan, also provide a similar compulsion example, suggested by Japanism and defined by market availability. The French statesman Georges Clemenceau got hooked on kogo, likely informed by his Parisian cultural circus, the like of Edmond de Goncourt, as well as the eminent art critic Philippe Berti, whose kogo eventually ended up in his collection, as you can see here. But Clemenceau appreciated them out of context of views, from their former qualities rather than their historic function, nurturing his fantasy, once again, of Japan to hold, touch, and contain, hands-on. The MMFA collection reflects, in a way, and this is just a small example of the collection, of course, for sort of stringent times, reflect an idea of Orient formed in Canada and not only at the turn of the century. Colonialist gaze and Japanism informed our collectors, channeling their taste and shaping our holdings. Lost in translation, objects devoid of the cultural significance were reinterpreted according to the new paradigm. Appreciated for their tactile qualities, these commodities were easily carried and accessible on the market thanks to the continuous outpour from Japan. Western demand was titillated and at the same time satisfied by the ready availability on the market. When material objects circulate in multicultural contexts, as Iside just mentioned, their definition changes and acquires multiple facets. Knowing the space and time of a collection like ours facilitates a critical reinterpretation. By acknowledging that these early practices of collecting were influenced by colonial gaze, we may start to understand the migration, interpretation, and commodification of the others through their materiality, from cultural signifiers to commodities to art collectible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florencia and Laura, for your contribution. Very interesting, especially because we had the opportunity to compare two museums. And now we move on with the third group of papers by Karen Tam, artist and independent scholar, and Annette Loeseke, lecturer in the lecturer in museum studies at the New York University, Berlin. Illustrate papers which illustrate the role of mission and colonialism in narrative and display choices of Asian collections. So please, Karen, how did the view, needs, and purposes of the missionaries affect, let's say, the presentation of Chinese art and culture in the Jesuit Museum of Chinese Art in Quebec? Please, Karen.
Thank you, Elisabetta, and thank you also to Iside and Helen for including my paper in the conference and the publication. So my paper focuses on early 20th century, like once popular, now very little known museum called the Musée d'Art Chinois that was established by the Jesuits in Quebec for the presentation and understanding of Chinese culture and art, to edify the faithful at home, as well as to raise funds for their missionary work in China. The museum disseminated these works of Chinese art and objects for close to 60 years. And through their collection, which is now housed at the Museum of Civilization in Quebec City, and also through the missionary exhibitions and the newsletter called Le Brigand, the Jesuits wanted to counter negative perceptions, preconceptions of China by Canadians at the time, and to show China to the Quebec public, or at least their interpretation of China. This paper focuses on my art installations called Nous sommes tous très migrants, we are all robbers, that are inspired by this museum. But for the presentation today, I'll just give a brief overview of the ways the Jesuits themselves shaped the interpretation and perhaps even perpetuated stereotypes of Chinese culture and the Chinese community in Quebec. So before 1931, there was very little information on China available in Quebec. There were 19th century travel stories that spread the popular image of a decaying China, and negative representations of its peoples fueled anti-Asian sentiment in Canada and formed prejudices against or towards the Chinese. The missionary review, Le Brigand, and the Musée d'Art Chinois were the principal publicity vehicles or propaganda vehicles of the the Canadian Jesuit activities in China. Illustrated with drawings, photographs, and engravings, Le Brigand entertained its readers with articles on Chinese culture and informed them about the mission's China's activities. While most of the articles in the newsletter praised Chinese culture and endeavored to actively oppose anti-Asian prejudices, there were others that actually demonstrated intolerant and condescending judgment and attempts to impose the Jesuits' Christian values on certain practices of the Chinese converts, which they deemed superstitious. So now kind of going to the Museum of Chinese Art, it was founded in 1931 by Father Joseph Louis Lavoie. And it exhibited its collection in photographs in sumptuous rooms where it deployed the exoticism of China to seduce viewers. The Chinese objects collected were not necessarily fine art, but chinoiserie, crafted in the Chinese style for the Western market. Quite a number of these were from the orphanage in I just missed my thing. The orphanage in China near their mission. And the rooms themselves were cozy and quote unquote Chinese, but not too much. You know, the works of art, decorative objects were organized in large cabinets of curiosities, which visitors could admire at leisure, as well as other objects that would stimulate religious fervor. So some objects were sent from colleagues in China for exhibition or to be sold at profit in the museum boutique to support the mission. Its collection included sculpted wood, frames, jade, ivory, figurines, paintings on silk, cloisonné, and even an imperial bed. As I said, objects for the museum and for the shop were not chosen for their aesthetic value, authenticity, rarity, or antiquity. Visitors could to the museum could leave with an exotic object made in China as evidence of their travels, not to China, but to the Chinese museum, and as material proof of their contribution to the Catholic mission. The Jesuits continually defined China on Western terms, and China was projected through the beauty of its arts and crafts. Now, despite the museum's initial aim to counter negative prejudices that most Canadians had towards the Chinese people based on missionary accounts and their limited experiences with Chinese immigrants who often worked as laundrymen and in restaurants, the image of a, quote, civilized China that Father Levoix showed through the displays was a distorted one, and quite a contrast from the daily life of the inhabitants of Suzhou, where the mission was. And with the Brigand, the public would have seen China through the eyes of a Jesuit. Each publication yielded and raised more revenue for the mission. Now, when the Jesuits chose to show the reality of their mission in Suzhou, the depiction and sufferings of the white missionaries prevailed over that of the Chinese individuals who were represented by objects. I would also add that it was far from the reality of the Chinese communities within Quebec at the time, as during this era, the Chinese in Canada experienced much discrimination, facing anti-Asian sentiments, anti-Chinese sentiments, and racist legislations, such as head taxes and the Chinese Exclusion Act that banned almost all Chinese immigration from 1923 to 1947. Now, these types of incongruities are what interest me most and inform my exhibition project, as they are examples of colonial attitudes and mentalities that exist even today. Particularly the lack of recognition and contradictions between being fascinated with a different culture while simultaneously rejecting and fearing its people. And if I have just a moment, I just realized that I didn't share my screen, but I'll just quickly do that. I just have 4 images. And so my apologies. So just to show you, this is an image from my actual installation called Nous sommes tous très bigans, where it's a combination of fabricated sculptures as well as including objects like these pagodas from the original Museum of Chinese Art that were on loan from the Museum of Civilization. So these 2 pagodas, and then here are just some sample pages from the newsletter, and that you can see, if you can see, in the photographs, the interiors of the museum and how they were displayed. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Karen. Really, the images speaks and contribute, let's say, contribute a lot to your presentation. Is a great contribution. And now let's now hear from Annette, a reflection on the presentation of Asian arts and cultures at the Asian Pavilion of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and how coloniality again approach, how is coloniality, let's say, approach in this context. So again, not in their own terms, but through our eyes. So please, Annette, go ahead. And thank you again, Karen, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this event. I'm going to share my screen, my PowerPoint. Should be there, just a second. Yeah, should be fine. In my article, I reassess how Asia is being narrated by the Royal Asian Art Society, the KVVAK, and the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. The Royal Asian Art Society was founded upon a private initiative in 1918 and has collaborated with the Rijksmuseum since at least the 1950s. The majority of objects on display in the Rijksmuseum's Asian Pavilion are from the collection of the Royal Asian Art Society that is on loan to the museum. My article explores the central role that the Royal Asian Art Society has played in putting together a collection of artifacts from countries in Asia, producing a narrative for the Asian Pavilion, supporting research in the field, and communicating results to a wider audience. At the same time, the Royal Asian Art Society has been promoting its own image by connecting to the National Museum in the Netherlands, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In highlighting their own activities, the Royal Asian Art Society commends itself for setting international standards in terms of what has been considered as art from Asia. On its website, it places itself in the context of Western museums. Against this backdrop, the Royal Asian Art Society produces a narrative of the Netherlands as an internationally renowned, if no longer imperialist, world power. I argue that a network of diverse private collectors as well as museum curators have cooperated in painting a certain picture of Asian art in the Netherlands. But has art from Asian countries been the main narrative? Or can we identify other motivations in collecting and presenting Asian art? Building on publications such as Avinoam Shalem's 2012 article, What Do We Mean When We Say Islamic Art in the Journal of Art Historiography, I explore to what extent Asian art is a European notion, or in this case, a Dutch notion. In my article, I argue that the narrative that the Asian Pavilion produces in the context of the Rijksmuseum is a kind of contestable, intangible Dutch cultural heritage. Instead of considering a Dutch perspective on a given Asian cultural heritage, I scrutinize the Dutch production of something like a Dutch Asian cultural heritage. The Asian Pavilion connects to the narration of Dutch cultural history in the Rijksmuseum through the connoisseurship and sophistication of Dutch actors, rather than a mere selection of high-quality artifacts from countries in Asia. What is framed as Dutch Asian cultural heritage is in fact embedded in modern Dutch intellectual sociocultural history. Against this backdrop, I argue that not only do we need to reconsider the specific narrative of Asia in this Asian cultural heritage, we also need to scrutinize the opaque, intangible Dutch structure that has produced and keeps reproducing this particularly Dutch cultural heritage. We need to examine the Europeanizing effects of such a conceptual, academic, and cultural appropriation that enables the formation of a research area or the shaping of academic disciplines as emphasized by the Royal Asian Art Society through their different activities. Such processes of conceptual appropriation that are crucial in constituting a discourse in the first place have been slightly neglected in recent debates about provenance as material and or legal ownership and about restitution, return, and repatriation. In my view, in centering around objects and collections, recent debates often tend to neglect the conceptual appropriation and epistemic dimension of collecting and producing knowledge in colonial and in fact post-colonial contexts beyond museum walls. While I emphasize the importance of debates on restitution and return, I strongly recommend to scrutinize blind spots within such debates at museums and universities in Europe and explore to what extent recent debates on return peculiarly perpetuate European conceptual frameworks about cultural heritage built in colonial and post-colonial times. I conclude with a question. To what extent might the focus on disputable European notions of objecthood and collections defy our museums and in fact our society's attempts to critically question a colonial and even a post-colonial approach to museum and memory politics? And how can we dismantle persisting conceptual frameworks and imagine approaches that might work in today's super diverse, hyper-connected societies, in addition to and beyond current debates on return? Thank you.
Thank you to you both, Karen and Annette, very interesting. And now we move on the last but not least group of papers. The articles by Maria Szymańska-Ilnata, curator at the Asian Pacific Museum in Warsaw, and Sofia Lopes, deputy director in charge of the Quokon collection at the Orient Museum in Lisbon, which consider the logistic and conceptual challenges in the establishment and management of a museum with Asian collections. So please, Maria, could you summarize the main challenges that, for instance, the Asian Pacific Museum is gradually overcoming to fulfill its important cultural role in contemporary Polish society? Please, Maria.
Thank you, Elisabetta. I'm very happy to participate in this event. I will now share my screen. I hope you will see my presentation. I will talk about the Asia and Pacific Museum, where I work since almost 10 years. The Asia and Pacific Museum grew out of a private collection of Indonesian arts and crafts created by one man, Andrzej Wawrzyniak. It was founded in 1973 and soon started to include artifacts from other Asian countries. It organized several temporary exhibitions in different places in Warsaw, but was not able to prepare the permanent exhibition due to the lack of a proper place. Finally, in 2016, the first section of a permanent exhibition devoted to the musical cultures of the Asia and Pacific was opened. Now we are working on the next section, which should be realized at the beginning of the next year. It will consist of 3 galleries presenting the history and cultures of Central Asia, Mongolia, and Indonesia. The ultimate goal of our team of curators, consisting of art historians, cultural anthropologists, and musicologists, will be to prepare an interesting, valuable, and modern long-term exhibition suitable for Polish visitors and well embedded in a historical, cultural, and social context of Poland. The situation of the Asia and Pacific Museum in Warsaw is quite different from that of museums in Western Europe. The basic difference derives from the historical conditions which influence people's knowledge, mentality, and needs. Poland has never had close links with any Asian country. It did not have colonies nor any tradition of concluding research in Asia. The larger group of our museum visitors is made of people who do not know much about Asia. To cater for their needs, the museum has to provide very basic information, which is easy to understand and remember. However, the museum mission should also be to encourage other groups to visit, in particular young people. We believe that visiting a museum which presents other cultures, religions, and traditions can help promote tolerance and acceptance of difference in a society where the presence of foreigners is quite a new occurrence and still leads to misunderstandings. The concept of our permanent exhibition is based on the idea of a journey to the East, the cultural worlds of Asia and Oceania, which the visitor is supposed to enter from the perspective of a European or even a Pole. Our goal is to present not only the traditional, often idealized version of Asian cultures, but their real contemporary face, which is very complex. We decided to use our exhibits, which are mostly very traditional items, to explain the history and the traditional facet of cultures. Multimedia will serve to illustrate the changes, foreign influences, and modernization. We are aware that cultures and traditions are changing dynamically and that we are not able to present anything in an objective way. For this reason, we will make the curators visible in our exhibition. They will become guides presenting the exhibits they choose. They will tell their own story about the culture or region that became their passion and to which they devoted many years of research and work. Such challenging tasks will be fulfilled following the newest trends in museology and by making use of the achievements and the developments of all related fields of science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now from Poland, we move to Portugal, opened in May 2008. Museu Orient in Lisboa is the youngest museum presented in this publication. Sofia, what are the main problems and most critical choices and decisions faced by the museum to assert its function as mediator between Asian cultures and contemporary Portuguese culture? Sofia, please.
Thank you very much, most of all, for participating in this event. I would like to make a really brief presentation of the Orient Museum, but what I would like to call attention is for the fact that it's an Orient Museum. So it's a museum in a post-colonial country. So of course we have problems that considers this kind of questions that are emerging now, not now, but are really most prominent now, at least here in Lisbon. And at the same time, I would like, while I'm presenting the museums, that we can speak about, or we can think about this idea of reduction of polysemy and metonymy. What I mean is that we should think that we are maybe reducing the many meanings of the objects, but not only of the objects. We are also reducing the different and various meanings of the institutions itself. So to understand how we do the exhibitions, we should understand the information we have on the objects, but also the information we have on the institutions. So I'm going to share here. The Fundação Orient was founded in Lisbon in 1988 and created the Orient Museum in 2008. Its statutes affirm and nurture the historical and cultural relationships with Asian countries, with a particular emphasis on the context in which the Portuguese established a presence, such as China. Its program focuses on the idea of the journey as a way of enrichment of knowledge through cultural encounters with Asia, and especially on the diversity of Asian cultures. It's in its most varied artistic, narrative, performative, and religious expressions. Its program includes the presentation of its two key collections, Portuguese Presence in Asia and Quoquan. The general public, as well as the specialist public, particularly in areas such as the social sciences, have come to question the pertinence of national and...
Sofia, sorry to interrupt you, but we cannot see your PowerPoint. I don't know if...
No.
Sorry, but since Karen wasn't able...
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Sofia, again.
Sorry. Okay, the general public, as well as the specialist public, particularly in areas such as the social sciences, have come to question the pertinence of national and international museums dedicated to themes around geographical explorations of the past, similar to ours, associated with the ideological hegemony of the West over the other. It is very important for museums to recognize the existence of this ideological context at international and national level and to question it, but also to inform that there is a need for a more detailed analysis that can lead us to verify the existence of different settings and to be aware of a far more complex reality inside museums and organizations alike, which lead to advanced setbacks and intermediate positions. So what about programming with these two collections of the Museum of the Orient? Everything works out well, considering they represent two different ways of collecting, incorporating, and exhibiting. So let us just see fast what it is, Portuguese Presence in Asian collection. It was systematically acquired in national and international auctions, and includes private and other museums' collections loaned to the museum. This collection contains a wide range of decorative arts with 3,000 works and documents witnessing the historic heritage of the Portuguese presence in Asia. The generating concept of this collection is an Oriental utopia of the Portuguese. It includes objects from the Neolithic period to the 20th century. Now, the other collection, the Quoquan collection, it was donated in 1999 to the Orient Foundation through the French sinologist Jacques Pampano, its director. It was from the Musée Cocon, sorry, in Paris. And it was unaided due to the lack of the interest of French government in coming up with a solution for the rehousing in suitable presentation of these artifacts, because they are considered artifacts and popular artifacts. So the Cocon collection built up through the gathering of objects from their places of origin, more connected with anthropology, not history of art, and around of the theme of Asian popular material culture, performing arts and religious practices, together with associated narrative heritage, is different in theme and in mode from the Portuguese presence in Asia collection. So how about programming with these two collections? How can we do, considering that they have become, in a sense, independent from each other? How can we exhibit, making them complementary? The program follows a fundamental axis that, from the outside, would reduce the distinction between the collections, that of cross-referencing the fields of history of art and anthropology, for the study and evaluation of witnessing accounts, whether of the Portuguese presence in Asia or Asian cultures, and then presenting to the public a global perspective on the artistic and cultural heterogeneity of Asia. However, the collections are perceived, even in the discourses of the technical team, as separate in terms of the canons distinguishing between erudite and popular arts. The ideological distinction is somehow reinforced by the individuality of each collection at the most pragmatic and organizational levels. Beyond the idiosyncratic ways and means of acquisition, the collections arrive with independent inventory databases with their own classifications and inventory numbers as devised in Paris at the Musée Cocon, and they are organized by two curators of history and anthropology respectively. The collections are also allocated in two distinct and defined exhibition spaces. So what I'm trying to show you and to explain to you is that there are, even if we are always trying to present them in as a whole or together, the collections were constituted and were organized and were growing up inside the museum with a really independent character. Our efforts for broadening polysemy, reducing metonymy, so having more meanings and reducing the idea of with an object trying to represent the whole or a community or a culture only through an object. Among the numerous national and international exhibitions held in relation to the Cocon collection, particular mention should be made of Chinese opera, that I will show you now. We have a slide on Cocon collection, and I will go through some objects and show you directly Chinese opera. Among the numerous national and international exhibitions held in relation to the Cocon collection, particularly mention should be made of Chinese opera, currently still on display at the Musée d'Orient. It challenges their audiences with a different perspective on Chinese culture, focusing on popular beliefs, rituals, the diverse pantheon of gods, the social cultural practices in general, through the heterogeneity of the themes and objects on display. So we try to have in a way, try to broaden the polysemy and reducing the metonymy by showing 280 objects, considering just one theme like Chinese opera. So when museum collections are analyzed, it is not only the objects that undergo a process of identification according to a usually unilateral standard. The institutions themselves are frequently subject to the same partial examination. Similarly, just as we rarely address the stories associated with the objects, neither do we usually discuss and take into account the individual stories of their museums and staff. We should therefore approach polysemy and metonymy in a more ambivalent fashion. Just as the objects do not exist dissociated from the subject matter and the context of their usage, museums are a set of personal and institutional contexts that should equally be understood according to their specific social and cultural settings. which define all of their diverse functions and meanings. So in the case of Cocon collection, for example, through its establishment, though its establishment derives from the pioneering vision of its collector, Jacques Pampano, aiming at extending the knowledge of Chinese and Asian civilizations beyond academia, it could not be influenced by political issues that the prevailing aesthetics and the random intervention of chance. As the Goan researcher Jason Fernandez stated, taken as an example, the display of a statue of the Indian goddess Yelama in the Cocon exhibition, Gods of Asia, the absence of Islam and Christianity in the collection is significant. On the other hand, if we speak about the collection Portuguese presence in Asian, the rich section dedicated to Indian and Indo-Portuguese art reflects the presence of numerous private and public collections on this theme in Portugal, while in contrast, Muslim Asia fails to gain due representation. So what we are trying to do is, as I don't want only to raise questions, I would like also to say that we are trying to enter in a new project where we will create a permanent exhibition on Cocon, because we don't have it, and we will have just some few objects, and we will have a lot of different specialists speaking about each of these objects, so we can really have and improve to have different meanings on the objects. And this is just a starting point, the milestone, so we can go not just on the objects, like speaking only about its origins and their different functions, but to speak about emerging issues and that local communities here in Lisbon need to be issued. And I'm also speaking about the issues associated with sustainability, as the United Nations are defining the 17 objectives. So I'm sorry, I tried to speak about a lot of things, and maybe it was a little bit confusing, but if someone has any questions, I can gladly answer it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sofia and Maria. And before thanking all the contributors of this very last part, I hand back the word to Iside, that would like to raise one very last point before the Q&A section. Iside.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you to all the contributors. And as Elisabetta said, I just want to raise, just want to say a few more things. First of all, I would like to mention the only case study from the publication that has not been discussed yet. Unfortunately, the author could not attend today's event, but I'm going to say a few words on her behalf. Marta Boscolo-Marchi presented the case of the formation and development of the collections at the Oriental Art Museum in Venice, of which she is the director. Originally put together by Prince Henry of Bourbon in the late 19th century, this collection can be taken as an example of the intricate network connecting collectors and museums across Europe and beyond. In fact, after the death of Prince Henry, only a part of the original collections went on to become the core of the Oriental Art Museum in Venice, the rest having been sold to many different customers and dispersed. This is why the history of the museum in Venice is intertwined with the histories of many other museums, such as the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg and the Colla Museum in Bergen. To research and put together all these histories like the pieces of a mosaic would mean to be able to map and trace the history of the collection as a whole, reconstructing its original identity and identity of each of its parts, as entire sections still need to be catalogued and studied. And to this, I would like to add that this is just one instance where projects of cooperation and exchange of knowledge and expertise can be hugely beneficial. This message comes through rather strongly in our publication, which ultimately intends to pave the way to further activities aiming at promoting the value of this special cultural heritage, greatly important for so many. From source communities to diasporic Asian communities, from those who acquired it and those who have the responsibility to take care of it and make good use of it. In particular, Asia Collections Outside Asia presents an open invitation to all those interested in contributing with ideas, suggestions, and proposals to take this engagement towards initiatives that through networking, collaboration, and partnership can make more visible and more accessible those museum collections of Asian materials that for different reasons are underestimated, less known, and more troubled. And with this, I think I would end this part of this event, and I give you back to Elisabetta, and we probably are going to have a couple minutes of break. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so we are going to have, thank you, Iside, thank you very much. We are going to have a very short break, just a couple of minutes, no more than that, to have a glass of water and to let our idea settle before we start the Q&A section. But please, don't leave us, stay tuned, just a couple of minutes. And before closing the section, I would like to thank again all the contributors, and of course, to say personally thank you to Iside and Helen to giving me the opportunity to be part of this project. Thank you so much, and see you in a few minutes.
Shall we start with the question? I can see that some questions are coming in.
Yes. So let's start then with the question. Natasha Suhadolnik is congratulating us for the wonderful and very relevant publication. So congratulations to all of you. And she asked, actually she put the question to Karen Tam. She asked, you mentioned, Karen, there were objects from an orphanage. I'm sorry if I missed it, but this orphanage, Tushanwan workshop in Shanghai, I would appreciate if you could elaborate a bit this part about the orphanage. This is the question from Natasha Suhadolnik to Karen Tam.
Sure. Thank you for your question, Natasha. I did really briefly mention it. So yes, it is this orphanage, the Tushanwan orphanage workshops. And if I can just talk a little bit about it in case people aren't, not everyone is familiar. It was run by the Jesuit missionaries outside of Shanghai, who housed and clothed and fed displaced orphans. And they also ran these workshops, art workshops that included printmaking, photography, publishing, painting, stained glass, what else is there? Metal casting, embroidering, woodworking. And in a way, it was like a place where Western and Chinese cultures and art could mix and integrate with one another. And objects from this orphanage workshop were exhibited at international expositions, notably those of 1900, 1915, 1933, and 1939, and were awarded prizes. They were also sold overseas to support the mission. So such items were similar to the two pagodas that I had quickly showed you in my slide presentation, as well as other objects provided from these from the orphanage. So thank you.
Okay. There is another very interesting question by Viba Joshi. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, the names and surnames. She enjoyed the presentation, and in the current discussion on decolonization, how do museums convey the colonial histories, especially difficult histories to school groups, and how much of this is reflected in history of the country's colonial past, if it is taught in the school curriculum, for instance. And still, Viva Joshi is continuing. I am presuming that there is an education officer section in these museums that caters to school visits. So this is the question. Actually, is not addressed to somebody specifically. So anyone who would like to reply to this question is very welcome, please. So it is about the discussion on decolonization and how museum is conveying this idea toward the school visits and students.
Maybe I can, no one wants to. So I think it's not an easy process. For example, here in Lisbon, I'm sure Elisabetta knows also what I'm talking about, and maybe some of you or most of you. We are having some problems with, and I understand the positioning of these groups, with groups that want to, how can I say this in English, how to stop this kind of production activities that still remember our colonial past, and they think we should finish it. We can also speak about the destruction of statues, painting the statues, painting colonial symbols everywhere. So you can imagine the problems like museums like the one in which I work, the Orient Museum, because of course the objects we have, as several other museums all over the world, have the objects we gathered. It represents, the document, the contact. Of course, the problem is that the kind of readings or the kind of information that we present, because we can present the same objects, but giving other information, other interpretations, more than the ones that we are used to. Considering the activities like an educative service that can do with schools to speak about these questions, I think it's not that difficult. We can make a list of concepts. We can have strategically defined a list of concepts that we have to work on, like colonial, post-colonial, and ideas of races, of ethnic, to deconstruct all these kind of concepts that we usually, normally, even in our normally day, we speak about. And I think this is not the problem to reach the schools, because this is easy, we can do it in activities. The problem is really to get together the collections. Okay, for example, we made now an exhibition. We just opened an exhibition called The Turn of the Goddesses. So we speak about the objects that are presented are posters, Indian posters. And we decided to, let's talk about questions of gender, and let's talk about colonialism and post-colonialism. And of course, this is the basis for the educative service to work. So what we do is we speak about an historical introduction on the use of posters in India, okay? And we reached in the beginning to the ideas that they had engravings on their goddesses. They reproduced their goddesses in engravings, and when the British entered, sorry about my English, entered India, they introduced lithographies, and so after some time, they also introduced off-press print. So what they did was to, how can I say it in a not so bad manner, but to clean up the images of their goddesses, of Indian goddesses. So they were like Indian goddesses with monstrous faces and images, and they were a little bit cleaned up. I don't want to be so general, but it's difficult to explain. So this is the issues that we, in the educative service of the museum, what we do is we call the schools here and we speak about these questions. We don't want to be activists. I don't think a museum should be activists. I think museums should work with activists, should work on these questions, and should always, always try to show both sides. And by this, I mean the side of an institution that works with objects that are associated with the symbols of the colonialism past, and but also to see the different testimonies. You understand? Because I don't think there is a wrong part and the correct part. We have to show them all. I don't know if I made myself clear. It was a little bit complicated, yes, but
I think it's quite clear, at least to me. And I saw two raised hands. One is Laura and then Maria Sobotka. Please, Laura.
Yes. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to sort of comment on Sofia's, you know, in our museum, we have quite a very well-developed educational department, and our new galleries, which have been sort of opened up before the pandemic, were about, you know, trying to convey as many voices as possible within the galleries. So the multivocality, the sort of not two sides, but multiple sides of an object, how the biography of the objects actually can tell and sort of enlighten, inform about, you know, migration, translocation, you know, adaptation, permutation, all this, and also the fact that as a curator, I only just one voice of a choir of voices. And so how do we actually get to explain this to the museum visitors when they come through the galleries? Because, you know, the physical space of the galleries is limited. So how much of this information can you actually sort of provide that the visitor would be able to read or would be able to sort of support within, you know, the 150 words panels? So we are actually in the process of developing an app, as many museums are, that would provide, you know, different channels of interpretations and different kind of aspects, from musical performances, you know, sort of témoignage, like oral witnesses, and you know, text, and also the participation of the visitors, because the visitors are to be you know, in a new museum for the people, as it should be for the new, you know, definition of the museum. It's actually to sort of let people be at home at the museum. So by doing this app, you would have, like, you know, people responding to a specific artifact, telling their story, their anecdote, the history behind from their point of view. And all these information will be available, you know, digitally. So the education department is working on this, and curators are involved, but also people from other communities, you know, all these different intervenants that are actually going to sort of pitch in and trying to sort of make this app as relevant as possible in current, you know, post-colonial or whatever the colonial, you know, context. And as far as I'm concerned, I feel that for us as curators, it's important to sort of highlight the history behind the appropriation and the migration of these objects. So due diligence and provenance are very important, and being transparent in saying this, so to sort of make it available online, or, you know, through all the different channels, educational. This is how we are going forward. And I think it's the only relevant, as far as I'm concerned, it's the only relevant way for our collection as a collection in Canada, one of the oldest in Asian art, and never been really, you know, sort of revalued. I am the first curator of Asian art at the museum, so I have to go and sort of look at these objects, you know, in a way with a fresh look after 100 years in the reserve. No, not 100 years, but, you know. So okay. I think there is a way forward, and I think digital intervention is also very much welcome. That's it.
Thank you. Very interesting, Laura. And Maria, would you like to answer also, or to contribute to this question?
Yeah, sorry. I think there was a lot already said about in response to this question. I just wanted to say that in the case of Germany, the German Historical Museum, so after curating an exhibition on Germany's colonial past, there were many calls in the public, and the museum afterwards integrated this special exhibition also in their permanent exhibition. I think before, and the German Historical Museum in Berlin is probably the biggest museum on the history of Germany, at least, and it's not about Asian art, of course, but they only very recently added this into their permanent exhibition. And I think in the case of Oriental, or what we call Oriental Asian art museums, it's still a long way to go. And I co-curated an exhibition on Japanese tea ceramics in the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg, Museum for Arts and Crafts in Hamburg in Germany. And it was not too easy to include the information that the Japanese were already in the 16th century trying to, or not only trying to, but robbing not only ceramicists, but also tea ceramics from Korea and brought them to Japan. And this is a very sensitive topic, of course. Yeah. And I know that the Japanese consulates or the cultural centers, they also go to museums and they tell you to not talk about this, for example, which, yeah. At least I know a couple of cases here where this was the case. Thank you.
In fact, I participated to a conference where it was this topic was risen again, and it was really sensitive. I have a question for you, Maria Sobotka. Is from Amber Kathleen Bullock again. She asks, what attempts have there been to better help visitors to the gardens better distinguish between Chinese, Korea, and Japanese gardens?
Yes,
Maria.
Thank you very much for the question. There haven't been any real attempts to better help visitors to the gardens to better distinguish the three, the Chinese, Korean and Japanese gardens, except from what I just showed in my slides, that there was a general attempt to build a garden that was visually totally different from the Chinese and the Japanese one. So in case of the Chinese garden, which is actually the biggest Chinese garden in Europe, was not really comparable to the Korean one, but in the case when they compared the Japanese garden to the Korean garden, they wanted to build it at least 5 square meters or something bigger than the Japanese garden, which I think is a really funny fact somehow. So they just tried to find a concept that would be different visually, I would say, if that answers the question.
Thank you, Maria. Now I have a question for Helen Wang, again from Amber Kathleen Bullock. So she asks Helen, Helen, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, okay, sorry, because I couldn't see you. So the question is, you mentioned that the Asian coin collection isn't often considered art. How would you go about interpreting them in an exhibit to show their cultural importance so that we don't miss them? So this is the question.
It's a good question. One of the questions that sometimes my colleagues in the British Museum, they ask, Helen, can we have some coins for display? And I sometimes say yes, and I sometimes ask them where they will display the pieces, because if they're just putting them there for the sake of putting them there, then what's the point? So there must be some proper context in which they're displayed. Similarly, if they're displayed as metal manuscripts, which is often what coins are displayed as, they'll be put next to maybe some old books or something that is on paper. In that case, the lighting must be very low in order to be appropriate for the paper, for the printed works. But then you can't see anything. So the whole concept of display must be seen in displaying coins needs to be done in a very kind of sensible kind of way, in a realistic kind of way, because they're very small objects and many people will overlook them. They will naturally overlook them. There's recently been a really superb example of how you can display Chinese coins, or you can display things in a different kind of way. And I'd like to bring in Karen, if I may. after the event in 2018, Karen came to have a look at some of the collections in the British Museum of Chinese Coins, and I didn't know what she was going to do with this information. I found out last week, and it's the most amazing story. Karen came along, she looked at some of the material in the collection, and then she created something which is really quite spectacular. May I ask you, Karen, to tell us about it?
Sure. So yeah, it was like all thanks to this conference, to meeting Iside and Helen, and to seeing the collection, the coin collection at the British Museum, and also following Helen's blog on Chinese money, that I kind of over the past year or so kind of did more research on sort of coin armor, the tlinget. Coin armor, as well as like jade burial suit, and I wanted to make my own version of the jade burial suit, but using Chinese coins. And so I basically have a whole suit, and the idea of this is kind of in response to anti-Asian racism over the past year or so. But yeah, it's just kind of also related in a way to the numismatic charms, like the swords, and kind of taking inspiration from that. So
thank you, Karen and Helen. And I do have another question for Sofia Campos. He is from, I believe, Max Carrocci. Your museum, Sofia, has both folk and decorative arts collection. It is a wonderful opportunity to break from conventional museological typologies that tend to limit the public understanding of Asian cultures. How does the museum approach the possibility of eliminating the huge distance between ethnography and art? Thanks. This is from Max Carrocci.
Yes. As I was trying to say in my presentation, these two collections, the Portuguese presence in Asia and the Kokon collection, they were constituted and incorporated in the museum as really independent. The first one was bought mainly in auctions, and it also integrated private collectors' donations and some other collections of other museums that were not exhibited in their own museums, and that they were deposited in our museum. And so this is how this collection was art collection was constituted. On the other hand, as I told you, Kokon collection has a really different origin. I don't want to go back there, but it's a collection more connected with artifacts, with fieldwork, with anthropology. And so for sure, in many other museums all over the world, we have these kind of questions. But here in this museum, we have these two collections. I really don't know how this functions in other museums, but even inside our museum, because of what I told you about, they have different databases. Look, they have even databases for inventory that's different, because the one from Kokon collection came from the Musée Kokon in Paris. So its inventory was already done. So I want to explain to you that even physically, even in inventory, even in the space of the exhibitions, they are separated. So of course we know that, and we have been working on it to put together these exhibitions, okay, these collections, and to produce exhibitions where you can join together these objects. Why not? The question is that not only outside the museum, not only externally speaking, but also inside the museum, we tend to see it really, I think even the museologists, not only here, but in many other places, many other museums or similar institutions, continue to, even if they want to do the contrary, they continue to polarize these fine arts with the artifacts, and history more connected with fine arts, and anthropology more connected with ethnography and with this kind of artifacts, and their readings with field work and ethnography. So what I have learned, and I worked in the Ethnology Museum of Lisbon, what I have learned is if you are going to do an analysis on an object, you can do on any object. You can give different perspective. You can go through the historical perspective. You can give the anthropological perspective. This is what we should do, give really different, and that polysemy perspective that I was speaking about, that we can give another word, we don't need to speak about polysemy, but we can just say that we need more meanings, more perspectives from different areas, not only anthropology and history. So what we should do, for example, we will have an exhibition on Japanese traditions, rituals and traditions, performance. And what we will try to do, and this is our project, as you can see, I spoke about the goddess's turn on Indian posters. We have also this Japanese that I will be speaking to you about now. And we also have the one that I spoke in my presentation on a permanent exhibition for Kokon collection, a permanent exhibition that you don't have a lot of objects, and it's a permanent exhibition with its nucleus, its groups are rotative, they rotate. You maintain the place of origin, geographically speaking, but you rotate the theme. And this is what we can do. We will bring for all these exhibitions objects from the two collections. Okay, it's not easy because even curators and even museologists have difficulties and surpassing all this crystallization, all these ideas that gain body deep, you know. So, for example, for the Japanese, as I was saying, for example, if we speak about the cosmogony, the origin of Japan in sacred texts, we speak about the goddess Amaterasu. And so, for example, we will have everything that we have from the Kokon collection connected with this goddess, and we will put what we have from the other collection, Portuguese presence in Asia, together in the exhibition. And the question is that we really will want to try to do this. Artifacts are popular, but in a sense that they are democratically used. Okay, they're not really only associated with erudite persons or from upper classes. So, and you can see this in Japanese context in maybe an easier way. And so we will take advantage of that, because you can have a Butsudan shrine of a very beautiful and ornamented and decorated and beautiful materials and rich materials. And you can have in the same house the most simple and strict shrine, and which we have on Kokon collection. So I don't know if I explained well, but this is a long way to go, but at least we have to be more open about it. We have to speak about it, and we have to bring these subjects because we cannot continue to do what I tried to speak about metonymia. We cannot continue to, but this serves for everything. We cannot speak for a museum that is, for example, working as a colonial institution, as we cannot also say, we cannot represent the part, we can represent the whole from a little apart. So we cannot represent the identity of a Japanese community with one object. And this is what we do when we don't have a lot of information. And this is what we do when we don't gather a lot or as many as we can interpretations and views.
So thank you so much, Sofia, for your answer. Actually, we are running out of time, but there is a very interesting question. It is a question for anyone in the panel, and this is from Amber Kathleen Vallock, and this will be our last question. So anybody from the panel can answer to it. Is it common practice to seek insight from the local Asian community in your country for interpretation of Asian objects. I found it really, really interesting. So I don't know who would like to answer to this, to Amber. So if there is any contact to the local Asian community, I mean, this is the main topic of the question. To give, let's say, some explanation or contribution to the interpretation of Asian objects. I don't know if anybody, any of you.
Laura, to answer.
Yes, please.
With the empreinte residency.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to sort of hijack the stage again, but yeah, we have at the museum, we have different sort of intervention like tactics. One of these is actually how I actually met Karen Tam over 11 years ago. How many years ago? 10 years ago? So at the museum, we have this intellectual residence program for artists of the so-called, and I say so-called diversity, that is sponsored by the Conseil des Arts de Montréal. So it's an organization, you know, any sort of governmental organization in a way. And we take on one artist of the up and coming, I mean, emerging, I would say, more than up and coming, for an intellectual residence for 8 weeks at the museum. So the artist is actually paired with a curator. In the case of Karen, for instance, we were paired. And so she had the opportunity, and I had the opportunity to sort of exchange for a sort of, you know, 8 weeks period on a daily basis. And she could go inside the reserve, she could do, and we would, would exchange on topics that would eventually help her somehow, you know, as she did with Helen at the British Museum later, to sort of come up with, new works of art. In fact, we acquired in the new galleries now, we have a piece by Karen, which is like, it's a garniture piece. So there are 5 vases that are inspired by this Chinese imari garniture from the 18th century that was inspired by Japan. And she took on the same sort of shape, and she elaborated through her. I mean, she should be talking about the work herself since she's here and it's her work. And this is one way, one sort of tactic that we have. The other tactic is, as I mentioned before, is to sort of invite the public to sort of leave their own witness, account. And so we invite people from the different communities, and we're still in the process of inviting, people to come and sort of comment and explain works of art that are in display, from a from their perspective. And that would be recorded and available for all visitors to see. So I don't know, Karen, you want to explain your garniture piece now? It's so beautiful. Anyway, I love it.
Karen, would you like to say something?
No.
No. Okay. So with this, we have reached the end of the.
Sorry, yes, I think Helen wants to say just one last thing.
Oh, sorry.
Can I share my screen, because I have a picture of the jade suit that's made of coins, made by Karen Tam.
Ah, great.
Just very briefly.
Show it.
There it is, the jade suit made of coins by Karen Tam.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Wonderful, really. Thank you, Helen. Iside.
Yes,
yes,
I think that we are running a bit late, and as you see, this theme has really, attracted a lot of attention, a lot of interesting questions, and topics that could be discussed forever. But we need to stop here, I think. And I want, of course, for anyone who wants to still send comments or get in touch, they can also send the RAI their comments, and then they can be redirected to me and to any of the contributors today. And yeah, just and there isn't much else for me left to do than just thank everyone again for participating in the conference at the beginning, in this long process of the publication and to this event. And I just hope that this is not the end, you know, because with this publication, we are actually just trying to start a new story that can help these collections. And they can tell other stories. So thank you also to all those who attended and contributed with their questions and comments. And probably I'll just leave to Hanin to finish. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the contributors. Thank you for telling us about your paper and your interesting work. And thank you for everybody who stayed until this very end, over time even. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to close the event now. Bye-bye.
Bye.